Hello, everyone. My name is Frederick Wertz, and I'm the Director of Digital Services at the New York Genealogical and Biographical Society. In this session, I'm going to teach you about finding birth, marriage, and death records for ancestors who lived in New York State. This session is sponsored by my organization, the New York Genealogical and Biographical Society. For those of you that aren't familiar with us, we are a nonprofit family history society with a lot of expertise in New York family history research. For a century and a half, we have been helping researchers learn more about their New York ancestors by preserving historical records and making them accessible. Our website has a large collection of online records, many of which you can't find anywhere else. We also produce authoritative publications and create other types of educational material that can help you learn more about New York State records and research methods. And we routinely advocate for more open access to the historical records of New York State. Before we get started, I do want to tell you a little bit about this session. First of all, it's short. It's only about 15 minutes long because my goal isn't to tell you every last thing about New York birth, marriage, and death records. That would take up a lot of time, and you would wind up hearing a lot of information that isn't really relevant to your research. So instead, I'm going to cover some general things that everyone needs to know, and then point you to resources that you can use to find the specific birth, marriage, or death record you're seeking, whether that's a marriage certificate of a recent immigrant or the birth record of one of the earliest colonial settlers. For those reasons, this is the perfect session for beginners, but more experienced researchers will also come away with useful tips and resources. The very first thing that makes New York State challenging and a bit different is the fact that the colony was first established by the Dutch, which led to different record-keeping practices than other states that were initially organized by, say, the British. For some of those states, you'll be able to find very organized and well-kept town records dating very far back into that colony's history, but that's just not the case with New York. Even though the Dutch did not maintain control of the colony for that long, the habits that they established, as we'll see, were very hard for towns and cities of New York to kick, even after they came under control of the British and then became part of New York State. The most important thing to know for our purposes is that the Dutch viewed tracking births, marriages, and deaths as a function of the church, not the state. So records that we refer to as vital records, which are birth, marriage, or death records created by the civil government, simply do not exist for much of New York State's history. So for many of our ancestors, we'll need to look for religious records or other substitutes to find birth, marriage, or death information. New York tried again and again to essentially force the towns and cities of the state to start tracking births, marriages, and deaths themselves, but that just didn't really happen until the late 1800s in many places. As we'll see, a complicating factor is that some places eventually complied, while others continued to refuse all the way into the early 1900s. So we really can't be confident that a vital record from any given place will exist until after the early 1900s or so, though coverage does increase dramatically from the late 1800s. Different places started at different times, and this is one reason why it's almost impossible to give a single, concise explanation about finding these records in New York State. Each researcher will really need to hone in on their specific time and place of interest to get a concrete answer about the availability of these records. So even though they may not exist, it's still a good idea to seek out a birth, marriage, or death certificate as your first option, because if it does exist, this is definitely a record you want to have. A good way to get a general idea of whether or not one exists for your time and place of interest is to read our article on the overall timeline of New York State vital record keeping. This is a free and very comprehensive article on our website. You can access a link to it in the syllabus for this talk, or you can visit the URL on the screen, nygbs.org/vital records timeline. I highly recommend reading this article with your own ancestor in mind. You don't have to worry about reading it all the way from start to finish, but navigate to the time period you're researching in for the general overview of what may be available. Here are a few of the most important dates from that timeline. In the early 1800s, New York City began independently keeping track of some vital records. They initially tracked deaths and burials, and over time expanded to births and marriages. Keep in mind, though, that at this time, New York City essentially just means the island of Manhattan. Queens, Brooklyn, and the other boroughs were independent entities, and they started record keeping at different times. It's not until 1847 that New York State passes a law that actually requires towns and cities to keep their own vital records. For most towns and cities, this date marks the earliest possible date that a vital record could exist. I want to emphasize the word possible because, as I mentioned, many towns and cities simply ignored this law and didn't keep track of anything. Which, is understandable if you think about it, because a small town in upstate New York in 1847 has a lot more to worry about and to spend resources on than tracking these statistics. So in 1860, New York City starts keeping track of vital records a little more thoroughly, and shortly thereafter, other bigger cities around the state, like Buffalo, Albany, and Yonkers, begin better record keeping as well. Then, in 1880, New York State took another crack at comprehensive reform. A Board of Health and Bureau of Vital Statistics was created that year, and they passed a couple more laws urging compliance around the state. Finally, slowly but surely, more and more municipalities began to keep track of their vital records. Now, coverage was far from perfect from 1880 onwards, but it did generally improve over time. Still, it wasn't until 1913 that New York State finally got complete compliance. With an additional law, pretty much every municipality fell into line, and we generally think of 1913 or 1914 as the actual date where births, marriages, and deaths were tracked by governments. So, the good news is, if you're seeking a birth, marriage, or death certificate from after 1913 or 14, it's going to be pretty likely to exist, and it should be fairly straightforward to find. But before then, it really depends on the time and place. So, this has been quite a journey through time here, and you can begin to see why finding this information in New York State is so challenging. Again, this is a really brief overview, that I just gave. So I do want you to head over to nygbs.org/vital records timeline for all the details that you need to know for your specific research. So, on to the main question now. Given all of this complexity, how can we find the records we need? In the next slide, I'll show you a resource that will guide you to the birth, marriage, or death records you need no matter when or where you're researching. Your initial jumping off point for actually finding that birth, marriage, or death record you're seeking should be this free guide on our website. I can tell you, as the guy who builds, maintains, and manages our website, this is one of the most popular pages on the whole site, seeing thousands and thousands of visitors every month. And there's a good reason for it. It's a very common challenge researchers face, and this guide is really helpful for all places and time periods. No matter when or where your ancestor lived, you should be able to use this guide to find links to online indexes, records, or other resources to get the record you're looking for. So head over to nygbs.org/vital records guide, also linked in the handout for this session, and read the introduction to get started. The guide breaks things down by location first, so as you can see here in the table of contents, you would navigate to the section that applies to your research. Another thing that you absolutely must know about these records, they are not all contained in one location. New York City vital records are totally separate from vital records found elsewhere in New York State. And as you can see here, some other cities, like Albany, Buffalo, and Yonkers, also have their own collections of vital records for certain time periods. Within each section of the guide, for each location, you'll see a breakdown of the available records for each time period. Here is a snapshot of just a small section of the New York City part of the guide. As you can see, these are links to all relevant online collections of vital records and indexes. You'll find more than just links in the guide. We also give instructions for accessing the records and explain about any exceptions or quirks about records from each time period. Again, it's a really big guide, and it would be inefficient to simply create a presentation version of the guide and have you sit through the whole thing. The best way to use it is to skip to only the relevant sections for your research. So head over there right now. Again, it's free and open to the public and has already helped out thousands of people. And it's the best place to get started looking for the links you need to find the online records for your research. Now, if you perform a reasonably exhaustive search and determine you can't find a birth, marriage, or death certificate, there are a number of substitutes you can try. As mentioned before, church records essentially replaced civil vital records for much of New York State's early history, so those are your next best bet. In fact, for many ancestors, a church record will be the only record that exists that tracks with a birth, marriage, or death event. Now, keep in mind that church records don't necessarily precisely mark a birth, marriage, or death per se, but they do commemorate what are often very adjacent events. In religious volumes, you'll find baptisms, marriages, and burials, which closely track with births, marriages, and deaths. You should be careful with baptisms in particular, though, because adult baptisms were not at all uncommon. First, you should start by researching which congregations existed in the time and place of your ancestor. One good source for this kind of general information are town and county histories. Many histories written in the early 1900s are very detailed, give a lot of attention to churches and religious institutions, and are freely available on websites like Internet Archive and Google Books. Another tool you can use is our Religious Records Map. We recently created this tool, which maps congregations all over New York State. Each entry contains information about that religious congregation and has a link to its online records. We already have a few hundred churches on here, and we're going to keep adding more in 2021 and beyond. So visit nygbs.org/religious-records to use this tool. If all else fails, there are still other options, and I'll leave you with some suggestions before concluding this session. The most important thing to remember is that local research is really crucial and can help you find other substitutes for birth, marriage, or death records if these previous options have failed. The various towns and cities of New York State are all very different, so it's important to zero in on your county or town of interest and deeply research what is available for that area. This will lead you to some fantastic records, or at the very least, give you the confidence that you have exhausted all available options. One way to make sure you're covered for any county in New York State is to pick up one of our county guides. We have a guide for each county in New York, which includes a list of historical place names as well as a comprehensive listing of records for that county. This includes holdings of every notable brick and mortar repository, as well as a list of essential print and online resources. You can use these to make sure you're not missing any birth, marriage, or death records for your favorite New York county. Another final thing that's also related to this general local research point. There are always exceptions. I've spoken in broad strokes here in the interest of time, but this is why local research is so important. For instance, there actually are some Long Island towns that have very complete vital records from really early in New York history. There aren't all that many of them, but they do exist for some areas. Likewise, there are a few collections of vital records from the mid-1800s for a select few locations in New York State. So, my final advice. With New York State vital records and New York State birth, marriage, death records in general, never rely solely on general, broad information. It's good to know the general landscape of things, but in your own research, you always need to dig as deeply as you can into a specific location. That is going to lead you to the most success. So, this concludes my brief overview of this subject. Hopefully, I've given you a general look at the landscape of birth, marriage, and death records in New York State, and I definitely encourage you to go explore all the resources I've mentioned in this presentation and see what they can do for you and your specific research goals. Enjoy the rest of the conference.